Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you yet again to another one of Amet's extremely topical and extremely timely webinars. This webinar was generously sponsored by Donna Gary in loving memory of her late husband, Stuart Hunter Gary. As we speak, the United States Commission of Inquiry, which has been headed by Navi Pillay and which has been going on since 2021, is investigating both Hamas and the State of Israel for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And it's saying that all sides must be held accountable. International Criminal Court Commissioner Kamer Khan has recently been in Israel and in Ramallah and has been collecting, and in a morally equivocal statement between a terrorist group and a nation state, has been saying that we must protect and preserve, it's preserving evidence of, quote, war crimes being committed by all sides. Meanwhile, Israel is accusing the United Nations of ignoring wide-scale evidence of rape, especially during the Rave Music Festival of October 7th. There's been well-documented evidence by survivors of the Rave Festival that women have been gang raped. The massive amount of bodies that had to be collected and buried have been so mutilated that it's made it very, very difficult for Israeli authorities to investigate. The women's bodies tell a horrific story. We're now hearing from women, including Sheryl Sandberg of Meta, who have been horrified and outraged by the atrocities. And NBC News has been told about laying a woman down and repeatedly raping her, and having Hamas terrorists pass her from one man to another to be raped by several men. Another Hamas terrorist said that there was a woman that looked like an angel, and that 8 to 10 terrorists raped her and then shot her in the head. This was being said during an investigation. There are documents that were found in Arabic on Hamas terrorists being investigated, telling them how to say, "take off your pants" in Hebrew. Israeli women's groups have been trying to appeal to the United Nations and have felt terribly alone and abandoned. There's been a reluctance among women's groups and among the United Nations to conduct an investigation of this. Israel's critics are downplaying and even dismissing this evidence of massive sexual violence. We're honored to have with us here today Natasha Hausdorff. Natasha Hausdorff is a wonderful, wonderful barrister, as they say in England, and the head of UK Lawyers for Israel. Natasha is an attorney in London who holds law degrees from Oxford and Tel Aviv universities, and was a fellow in the National Security Program at Columbia Law School, where I went to school. Natasha previously worked for Skadden Arps in London and Brussels, and clerked for the president of the Israel Supreme Court, Justice Miriam Naor in Jerusalem. And she is frequently appearing on international media and discusses international law, foreign affairs, and national security policy on television and throughout the print and visual media. First of all, Natasha, welcome. It's really an honor and a privilege to have you. Before we begin, can you tell us a bit about the concept of proportionality in armed conflict?
I can certainly, Sarah, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. My deep apologies, I was a few minutes late. It's a hazard of the profession, unfortunately, and I have run straight from court. I'm very grateful also for the promotion, but I should perhaps clarify that UK Lawyers for Israel is an organisation I've been involved in for over 10 years as a volunteer, and I'm very privileged to serve as the legal director our charitable trust arm. But we have a wonderful CEO in Jonathan Turner, who has made this organization really a force to be reckoned with, and the length of victories, not all of which are, I'm afraid, public, but some of which are included in the website and news articles and brochures in terms of achievements. So I'm very privileged to continue to serve in a voluntary capacity and assist those efforts. And no more, perhaps, is that work more desperately needed than in the context of the misrepresentations of international law that we have been seeing, and in particular, this concept of proportionality. Proportionality in international law of armed conflict or humanitarian law has a very specific meaning. However, especially over the last couple of months, we've been seeing a misrepresentation of what proportionality means. And in many cases, it's presented as a sort of comparison of body counts. The grotesque consequence of that sort of analysis must be that, and many people seem to have embraced this approach, not a sufficient number of Israelis have died to merit Israel's response. Now, that is reprehensible, but it is wrong in law. It is also wrong in logic. There is, I think, as a matter of common sense, a problem with saying that one has to reciprocate in a similar manner against an enemy, a foe, no matter how reprehensible the atrocities committed by that foe might be. And that concept was perhaps put most forcefully in recent months by Douglas Murray, and I know his challenge to that concept, that very, very flawed concept of proportionality, went viral. The problem, I think, is with rejecting the proportionality on the basis of that assessment of a comparison of casualty figures, is that it causes many to reject the principle of proportionality outright. And that is difficult and problematic because a principle of proportionality does exist in international law. And it's important that we recognize what that is, because that will enable us to recognize that Israel not only complies with that principle of proportionality, but the measures that Israel takes in striving to uphold that principle, as with other aspects of the law of armed conflict, are really second to none. Israel, and this is in respect of the unprecedented challenges that it is facing in its conflict with Palestinian terror groups, but Israel has responded to that by developing innovative practices and specialist targeted munitions in order to ensure that the principle of proportionality is complied with. Now, with that trailer, what it means in international law is that a reasonable military commander needs to make an assessment. And that assessment is conducted on a strike-by-strike basis. And it involves a balance between the military necessity and the military objective that a strike is aimed at achieving. And that has to be balanced against the anticipated collateral damage. So that is damage to civilians and civilian objects that is foreseen. Critically, this is an analysis of intent. It is not an effects-based analysis. So we will all, of course, recognize the awful pictures coming out of Gaza and circulating. And there is undoubtedly destruction of what Israel has been targeting in terms of terror infrastructure. And it is plain that that terror infrastructure has embedded itself in civilian buildings, in residential areas, and in the close vicinity of protected buildings. We'll come on, I'm sure, to talk about hospitals. We have instances also of UNRWA clinics, of UN schools. So civilian protected buildings being provided as cover for the Hamas terror infrastructure. In that context, the proportionality principle applies according to what the army expects and anticipates in terms of a strike against an individual target. And that is informed by the intelligence that the Israeli Defense Forces have. And the assessment is made. Now, there is a track record that Israel has with respect to the application of international law and specifically the principle of proportionality. And this has been analysed through previous conflicts by high-level military officials, including those involved in the high-level military group, who've published a number of reports. And Israel's conduct throughout these operations in Gaza, so from Castle Ed in 2008, all the way to the present day Iron Swords operation, the analysis has been consistent, and that is with respect to the precautions and the measures that Israel takes, but also importantly, with respect to the involvement of army lawyers. Now, the Military Advocate General Corps sits outside the chain of command. They are answerable, the army lawyers, to the Attorney General, not the Chief of Staff. And that is important because frequently they will have to make calls on strikes. And it may be that the commanders decide that, that there is an important military imperative to conduct a strike, but it is up to the lawyers to help that commander make the assessment of proportionality. And they do so on the basis of the information that they have about civilians on the ground.
So there are determinations that are being made, according to what you just relayed, by the Attorney General. And at what point does a general determine that this strike is proportional to the military objective? And does the Attorney General have the ultimate say to say, no, you cannot attack this certain structure or building?
Well, I need to clarify that these targeting decisions are taken on a strike-by-strike basis, much lower down the chain. But the involvement of lawyers in that process, I would argue, is unprecedented in terms of law-abiding militaries around the world. Absolutely, the British Army, the American Army, it deploys legal experts and analysis when it is conducting its operations. But the very, very close involvement that lawyers have vis-a-vis the IDF is unusual, to say the least. Ultimately, however, I think it's also important to stress that law provides a basic level, a basic standard. And the law of armed conflict recognizes that even law-abiding armies and soldiers will inevitably partake in pretty horrific scenes. The expectation is that civilians will die as a matter of collateral damage. And I think in that context, it's important to stress that my experience of engaging with both those commanders making decisions and the lawyers informing them has given me the consistent impression that the military commanders in the field have to conduct an assessment that is even over and above the legal one, and that is a moral one. And that is informed by the IDF's Code of Ethics, Code of Arms, and by the moral ethical code that they adhere to. And when one considers the balancing act, the balancing equation, there are no hard and fast rules. It is ultimately the responsibility of the commander in the field, and that is a responsibility that is taken very seriously. It is no it is no short order, I should say, for a military commander to have to make that sort of decision, especially where collateral damage is concerned. And so it will depend on the facts and the circumstances of each instance. But to enable that balance to be properly struck and to reduce the number of civilian casualties as much as possible, the IDF takes certain measures. I'm sure many in the audience will be familiar with them. They involve warning civilians of impending strikes, and that, of course, has the effect of also warning the enemy of telling Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad where the IDF will be striking. But those warnings take the form of leaflets that are dropped from planes and drones. They take the form of phone calls to individual householders, text messages. Those warnings also take the form of a technique developed by Israel called knock on roof, which is a loud bang onto the roof of a building which is about to be targeted with a strike. And that is a final warning to enable any remaining civilians to have that last opportunity to leave. And it's interesting to note, I think, the number of videos that we have from on the ground in Gaza of buildings being destroyed by the Israeli Defense Forces. And it is a matter of common sense. Of course, it is understandable that the reason the camera is up and running and able to capture the strike as and when it happens is because of these warnings, and often because of knock on roof, which has occurred pretty imminently before the strike is conducted. So all of that is taken into account and is deployed for two real reasons. One, of course, is to comply with another key principle of the law of armed conflict, which is the principle of precaution, and to do everything possible to reduce the likelihood of civilian casualties. But it also enables Israel to better strike that balance as part of proportionality and to prosecute its military objectives properly. Because if we step back for a moment and contemplate what it is that so many people who misrepresent this principle of proportionality are actually asking Israel to do, they are asking the IDF to afford immunity to Hamas while they operate from within civilian areas and while they use civilians as human shields. And all of Israel's efforts over the last 2 months in terms of encouraging and assisting civilians to evacuate to the south of Gaza and now out of Khan Yunis is to prevent Hamas from achieving that sort of victory, immunizing itself from lawful, legitimate military strikes against it by holding those civilians, and these are Gazan civilians, hostage, as well as, of course, the Israeli civilians that it has so brutally abducted. And that is, I think, something that we need to be forcefully putting forward, that not only as a matter of law is this utterly unintelligible and illiterate, but also as a matter of common sense. What is being called for is a carte blanche for terror organizations. And that principle, that precedent, won't stop with Israel. It will ultimately bind all law-abiding states in seeking to combat this sort of terrorism and these unscrupulous individuals who use civilians as human shields. I note that in terms of the coalition forces' activities against ISIS and Mosul, these arguments were not being put forward, and that is because they are illogical. They do not enable legitimate military might to be used to counter terrorist forces, and they are as illegitimate in this case vis-a-vis Hamas as they would have been against ISIS also.
Excellent. Could you speak about, first of all, the primary responsibility of a government to protect its civilian population, and where is that in international law?
That's a very good question. I would probably fall back on, it's a matter of customary and international law. It's so obvious that it doesn't require stating that the acknowledgement, perhaps, in Article 51 of the UN Charter of the inherent right of states to self-defense is a reflection of that. I note that there's nothing in international law which bestows that right on states. It is simply recognized as being inherent because it is, I would argue, the primary function of government, responsible government, to keep its citizens safe. And in this respect, it has undoubtedly informed Israel's objectives in this operation of Iron Swords. They have been stated from the outset as the destruction of Hamas, to prevent it from ever having the capability of conducting another the 7th of October. And this is in circumstances, of course, where the Hamas leadership have said over and over again that they wish to commit the 7th of October over and over again, that this was just the beginning. And in that context, that has been one of the two key aims to prevent that from ever happening. The other key aim, of course, has been the return of the hostages, and that is equally about keeping Israeli citizens safe to the extent that that can be achieved. The dialogue and the discussion since the violation of the ceasefire by Hamas on Friday last week, that is focused around applying military pressure to Hamas in order to seek the further release of hostages as matters reached an impasse before, of course, Hamas fired in violation of the ceasefire agreement. So the requirement, the responsibility of government to protect its citizens informs all of Israel's actions in this case. When one considers Hamas as a government of sorts, it is responsible for the Palestinian Arabs living in Gaza. That is, unfortunately, the opposite of their aims. They have clearly stated their aims as being the destruction of Israel and the murder of Jewish people. And they use their civilians to further their aims. And rather than protecting them, what is being taught generation after generation is, unfortunately, that the highest calling in life is to become a martyr. And so they celebrate the creation of so-called martyrs. And by recent accounts, of course, it's impossible to know what the casualty figures truly are, but there's been, in the last few days, quite a bit of analysis that indicates that the figures coming out of the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health are far from accurate. I should also qualify even those figures by saying that there are two additional key factors that Hamas is not providing information on. The first, of course, is what percentage of the casualty figures that it is putting out are Hamas combatants or other Palestinian terror organization members, and how many are civilians. They're simply putting out global figures. And the other key part of the information, and missing part of the puzzle here, is how these people have purportedly died. Because one of the key issues that has been clear also from previous conflicts that is utterly left out of the discussion here, but for the discussion around the Al-Ahli hospital car park strike, because that was proven to be a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that fell short. More broadly, what is missing from the discussion is an acknowledgement of all of the other missiles that are being fired out of the Gaza Strip towards Israeli civilians that are equally falling short from both Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We don't know the figures on those as yet, and we certainly don't know how many civilians have been killed as a result of those missiles falling indiscriminately. Because, of course, we recognize that while Israel does have defenses in place, it has Iron Dome and it provides shelters for its civilian population. Hamas does the opposite. And there is no protection of Gaza's civilians from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad rockets. Unlike Israeli strikes, they come without warning.
Can you allow me to be a devil's advocate for a bit?
With pleasure.
Okay. How does one eradicate a theological nationalistic idea such as Hamas? Can it be eradicated through warfare? Or do you think that it will take on a life form of its own after the war, where they will hide behind this victimology? And their videos of their martyrs and their civilian casualties.
So in a word, no, one cannot eradicate this ideology purely through military means. It's important, though, perhaps before I go on to talk about how one does it, just to recognize the fallacy in this suggestion, which I've also heard repeatedly, that Israel's actions are simply creating a standard bearer for Hamas, are encouraging more support. I think it's plain that we've seen the opposite on the ground in the Gaza Strip. Occasionally we are seeing videos of those who are very critical of what Hamas has caused, what Hamas started in the context of this war, but also of Hamas's tactics in terms of using its civilian population as human shields, shooting fleeing civilians, preventing them from leaving areas that Israel is targeting, and also bombing those civilian convoys in the early weeks of this war while they were seeking to follow Israeli recommendations and evacuate to the south. So I think one is already starting to see a turn in terms of support for Hamas. But plainly, there remains a great deal of support for Hamas, not just in the Gaza Strip, but also very worryingly in the West Bank, in terms of recent polls putting well over 50%, some 70 to 80% of popular support for what happened on the 7th of October in the areas that are under the Palestinian Authority control, the so-called moderates in this equation. But if we step back for a moment and consider, what is it if it's not Israel's conduct that is radicalizing these people? What is it? Because you do not have 3,000 people who spontaneously wake up one morning and decide that it's a good day to slaughter Jews. That simply doesn't happen as a matter of rational common sense. That happens, and these were individuals from Hamas, from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, from Fatah, the PFLP, the affiliates of the PLO, and the so-called moderates in the West Bank. These people have been subject to 30 years of brainwashing and indoctrination, believing that the highest calling in life is to be a martyr, and understanding that their role, exalting martyrdom and understanding that their role is to slaughter as many Jews as possible. And this has been as a result of Palestinian Authority control over the education system, over the curriculum. It has manifested itself in textbooks, in children's TV programs, in football associations that are named after martyrs, in mathematical problems that involve calculating how many martyrs in each different scenario. And one has, I think, none of this is a surprise. Let me just be clear that this has been the subject of many reports from NGOs, Impact SE with respect to textbooks, NGO Monitor with respect to much of the curriculum, and the funding, the international funding of this curricula. In UN-run schools, UNRWA-run schools, according to UN statistics, about 3 out of 4 of the terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th of October were educated in the UNRWA school system. And that must give us pause for thought, because it is not Israel that is driving this incitement and hatred. It is the international community and the support that has been given, financial and otherwise, to this infrastructure. And one has to recognize that where hate is sown, war is reaped. And you cannot, absolutely cannot, contend with that ideology without an acknowledgement of it. In terms of proposals for the day after this war, they are, of course, still very much in development. But those that I have seen promulgated have all involved a concept of denazification, borrowing from the aftermath of the Second World War, and in conjunction with the Marshall Plan like initiatives to build an economy, but all recognizing that the denazification, that the wholesale reform of the Palestinian education system is key. And that education system goes hand in hand with another very, very troubling aspect of this, incitement and incentivization to terror, which is also supported by the international community. And that is the Palestinian pay for slay policy. This is a matter of Palestinian law, enshrined in law, whereby the salaries of terrorists are paid according to the severity of their crimes, so how many Jews they have managed to slaughter. And those salaries, I'll give you an example. Ali Kadi, one of the leaders of the Nukba force who planned the 7th of October attacks over a period of some 2 years, he was released in the 2011 Gilad Shalit deal. He's been paid a salary, including since his release, by the Palestinian Authority, which by all accounts allowed him the luxury of time to be able to plan and then orchestrate the 7th of October attacks. And this is another matter which, if the ideology is truly going to be dealt with, if the threat that Hamas and other Palestinian terror organizations pose to Jews, not just in Israel, but around the world, and pose to Western liberal democratic values, if that is going to be properly grappled with, then we need to address education and we need to address the terror salaries which continue to be paid.
Right. There have been a tremendous number of pieces of legislation, some of which have actually, unfortunately, not gotten anywhere here in the United States, that have been bogged down by political infighting about stopping these UNRWA textbooks from promulgating the extolling martyrdom, these mathematical problems about dead Jews, etc. But we have to see if we can get that passed. There's also a very ill wind that's blowing out of the U.S. State Department right now, where they want a contiguous Palestinian state stretching from Gaza through the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, if you will, with East Jerusalem as its capital. And that's while there have been these Berzit polls that you mentioned, which actually one of them was very disturbing, where they said 89% wants the Martyrs Brigade, the Al-Quds Brigade of Hamas to be in power. So can you comment on number one? I think there have been attempts to stop the UNRWA funding in Europe. And number two, your feelings about inserting Mahmoud Abbas as the leader, or another figure from the Palestinian Authority as the leader of Gaza after this war is over.
Well, what Israel has made clear thus far is that there will have to be some form of Israeli security assurance, most likely a presence in the Gaza Strip, because it is plain that when Israel withdrew in 2005 under international pressure, the promises by the international community and also the expectation that this would become a Singapore were disbelieved by many, I'm bound to say, and plainly proven to be false. One cannot snap one's fingers and expect democracy overnight. And actually, I remember, in the context of the first elections that were held in 2006, I remember a BBC reporter interviewing ordinary civilians in the cafes of Gaza City in advance of the election, and asking one gentleman how he would be voting. And his response was that he and his 6 sons would be voting for Hamas. I remember that 6 sons was quite a number to have. But when the reporter sort of moved on and didn't ask him how, with a few weeks still to go to the election, did he know how he's all of his 6 sons would necessarily be voting, I think he missed a trick. And I think it was extremely indicative of how, unfortunately, that society still worked, and the journey that had to be undertaken before real democracy could possibly take hold. And of course, we see the same in the West Bank, in that Mahmoud Abbas is in his 18th year of a 4-year term. And the only thing preventing a Hamas takeover in the West Bank, as they took over in the Gaza Strip violently in 2007, after the elections in 2006, the only thing preventing Hamas from taking over the West Bank and throwing their Fatah opposition members off of the roofs of buildings, as they did in Gaza. The only thing preventing that is an Israeli security presence and Israeli security cooperation with the Palestinian Authority at the moment. It's extremely troubling that after what we have seen over the last 2 months, we would not only be seeing calls emanating, some of them from the United States, for Mahmoud Abbas to be given control of the Gaza Strip, but also that these calls for a two-state solution are continuing. I cannot see how well the 7th of October remains within living memory. Any Israeli government can actively advance a prospect of a two-state solution. When one is faced with the inevitability of a terror state on one's border, and of course, Israel has a history of not learning from history. The Israeli people, I think, have a unique ability to advance on the basis of hope and trust, and a desperate belief that peace is achievable. And the consistent security concessions, and very hard choices that have been made in pursuit of peace are clearly testament to that. But even that goodwill, optimism, and desire to advance positively with one's neighbours is going to ultimately have taken a battering in light of what has happened, not least because the communities around the south of Gaza were those that were most actively involved in seeking positive cooperation, in seeking economic links. There were also, of course, it's an important number to remember, between January and August of this year, there were over 400,000 entrances from Gaza into Israel, mostly on work permits. And these saw individuals from Gaza often coming to work in the communities around the border area in the south of Israel, those that were attacked ultimately. And it's become clear investigations subsequently in terms of the material that was found on many of the terrorists that infiltrated on the 7th of October. This included detailed plans that listed individuals, household by household, how many children, whether there was a dog, whether there was a gun in the house, and often detailed instructions of what the terrorists were to do to each family, plainly put together on the basis of the evidence and intelligence that was gathered by virtue of these work permits. So in that context, again, I've not seen this discussed on international media, but it is a horrifying factor that the Israeli public has certainly internalized. And in that context, the suggestion that matters can simply pick up from where they left off is not credible. It's not workable, and it's extremely concerning that one hears proposals or propositions in the international community that are so far off the mark. This is unfortunately not new. And if I can give one example, I think it's a telling instance of where international pressure has been pushing peace further away rather than bringing it closer. And I'm particularly reminded of a remark by Mahmoud Abbas several administrations ago in respect of President Obama's policy on Israeli settlements, when he was calling for a moratorium on settlement building, and when he appeared to be blaming the settlements for everything that was wrong with the failing peace process. And Mahmoud Abbas said, "How can I be less Palestinian than the President of the United States?" And what he meant by that was that he could not go to a negotiating table and ask for anything less than was being demanded on his behalf by the President of the United States. He could far less leave a negotiating table, having achieved anything less than was being demanded on his behalf by the US. And in a context where, and let's be clear about what that demand ultimately was, it was coming from a position that Jews shouldn't be allowed to live in certain areas simply because they are Jews. Right? This idea that a Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria is illegitimate. Now, that ultimately, of course, does chime with the Palestinian Authority's demand that the West Bank be Judenrein, but it is not realistic. And it certainly wasn't realistic in the context in which any negotiations might have progressed in the time that Mahmoud Abbas uttered these words. And it is a strong indication that uninformed and deeply, deeply problematic positions being taken by international actors, in many respects allies of Israel, has the opposite effect of advancing peace. I come back to a point that we discussed earlier on, which is at the crux of this, at the center of this, is education. I've visited Ramallah on a number of occasions, and I've been extremely encouraged when I visited venture capital startup funds looking to create Silicon Valley in the Middle East, in Ramallah, looking to create economic links with the Israeli startup world and provide economic incentives, create a Palestinian middle class with a stake in society, one that would ultimately reject their current leadership that has not been serving their interests. But that can only properly proceed where the next generation is not educated to hatred in the fashion that it is currently, unfortunately, being subject to.
Right. I'm reminded of a quote by John F. Kennedy that peace does not exist in signed documents and charters alone, but in the hearts and minds of the children. So
and
we really
see that. We see that with the Abraham Accord.
Right.
And therein, if I may be permitted just another example, and far be it for me to sound in any way like I'm America bashing. I'm a big fan of the United States, and I certainly look forward to continued US leadership and promoting freedom around the world. But I'm also reminded of Secretary of State Kerry's remarks at the Saban conference. I think it was in 2016. Mark my words, he said something along these lines. There will never be a separate peace between Israel and the Arab world without a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Paraphrasing slightly, that's more or less what it was. How wrong he was, and how wrong he was proven to be with the Abraham Accords. And that, I think, also goes to show that what is either received wisdom, especially vis-a-vis the Israeli-Arab conflict, is oftentimes extremely misplaced and very, very damaging because it was plain, I think, to many already in 2016 because of that heart-to-heart, people-to-people engagement between Israelis and the citizens of many of those Abraham Accords countries, that peace was achievable, and that was being strived for many, many years by successive Israeli governments, and ultimately that proved to be successful.
So before I turn to my wonderful colleague, Joseph Epstein, who's going to read some of the questions that have come in, Natasha, you believe deeply that October 7th did usher in a sea change where foreign policy will be predicated on sober realism rather than hope and wishful thinking, at least among the Israelis, right?
I hope so. I anticipate that. It seems to me the only logical conclusion. But I'm also aware that I may yet be proved wrong. I was in Israel over the last few days. I was extremely the resilience and the strength of that country left an indelible impression on me in my recent visit, and that does appear to me to have gone hand in hand with the real realism and the acknowledgement of what Israel is dealing with and Israel's having to contend with, not just in respect to the 7th of October. We haven't talked yet about the geopolitical context here, but of course, one of the reasons that Israel's robust response and its completion of its aims vis-a-vis Hamas are so important is because the rest of the Arab world is watching very closely, including those entities that have yet to make peace with Israel. Hezbollah on the border, another Iranian proxy, is already attacking, of course, the northern and southern communities along the borders that Israel shares with terror organizations have had to be evacuated. And I think the Arab world more generally is keeping a very close eye. And so Israel's actions are not just critical vis-a-vis Hamas, but critical vis-a-vis the other threats that it is facing from the region.
Wonderful. And now I'm turning the podium over to Joseph, who will read some of the questions that have come in. Joseph?
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Natasha. This has been a very insightful presentation. So I'd like now to turn to questions that we have received so far from the Q&A function. So the first one was, could you please discuss how the IDF's decisions regarding when to strike or not have changed in this war? Versus past engagements in Gaza, as apparently there have been sources that have saying that the rules of engagement have been loosened and put lower in the chain of command.
Okay. I can't answer that question because the rules of engagement are not made public, and for good reason. If they were, then Hamas would adopt its practices in order to seek to thwart Israeli efforts and be better informed in doing so in that regard. The reason I referred to previous operations is because after the event, there has been the opportunity to investigate, and that has been done internally in Israel and also by bodies outside of Israel and independent bodies like the high-level military group that I referenced earlier. And the reason I think that track record and that past practice is important is because it speaks to more than just what Israel did in those previous operations. It speaks to the approach that the IDF takes more generally and the ethical approach that is embraced. And in that respect, although, of course, this conflict is different because the military objectives are different. Israel has never previously said it will destroy Hamas entirely. It will dismantle its ability to conduct any operations from the Gaza Strip. That has never been part of the previous aims. Many argue it should have been, but the leeway that Israel was afforded by the international community in previous conflicts was very much more restricted. And we can also perhaps talk about international responsibility in that regard for what happened on the 7th of October. But here, while the challenge is different and while the approaches are different, there are strong indicators that Israel's approach, generally speaking, is still consistently above the requirements of international law. And we see that from the steps taken to evacuate civilians, to provide warnings as to strikes, but also critically from the ground operation. Israel has superior air power. And if proportionality wasn't an issue, if civilian collateral damage wasn't an issue, then this war would have been over a long time ago. And it might not have involved Israeli forces going in on the ground. I say that with some, I say might not because, of course, the tunnel situation is a particularly difficult challenge, and some of them, by all accounts, are not reachable by aerial bombardment because they are built so very, very far underground, and 300 miles of terror tunnels does need to be addressed by Israel in pursuit of its aim against Hamas. But the fact that we have troops going in on the ground, and I'll give you the example of the hospitals, and Al-Shifa Hospital in particular, sending Israeli special forces into the hospital, as Reuters reported, with Arabic speakers and medical staff, in order to assist the differentiation between Hamas terror operatives and the sick, injured, doctors, nurses, medical staff. That is indicative of Israel maintaining the highest standards required by the international law of armed conflict in terms of proportionality, also, of course, in terms of distinction, differentiating between civilians and combatants. And maintaining also a high, the other principle, I'm not sure we've mentioned it yet, out of the three main, we've got distinction, proportionality, and necessity. So Israel is acting out of military necessity. It is not gratuitously attacking any targets in Gaza. It is going after the terror infrastructure where that is necessary for the achievement for achieving its military objectives.
Thank you so much, Natasha. So our next question has to do with Egypt. What are Egypt's obligations, or does it have any, under international law to allow refugees in from Gaza, or to in any way somehow ease the situation?
It has a very important obligation under international law, which no one I have heard discussing, and that is under a treaty of the African Union that I'm about to open up so that I do not get its name wrong. The convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa. Egypt acceded to that treaty in 1980, and it's important because that treaty incorporates a definition of refugee which is far broader than the Refugee Convention. And it includes, this is Article 1, paragraph 2, where it states the term refugee shall also apply to every person who, owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, or events seriously disrupting public order in either part or whole of his country of origin or nationality, is compelled to leave his place of habitual residence in order to seek refuge in another place outside of his country of origin or nationality. So absent that convention, if you were to ask me, does Egypt have a responsibility to open its borders to refugees in the sort of classical sense, those fleeing persecution, asylum seekers, I would say yes in respect of those fleeing persecution, but unfortunately those fleeing a conflict or serious disruption to public order would not qualify. But in Egypt's case, we have a local treaty that it is bound by, that it has decided to bind itself by already in 1980. And its obligations under that are clear. The fact that we have not heard any clamour in the international community for Egypt to comply with those obligations and facilitate the evacuation of civilians from Gaza across the border into Rafah on the Egyptian side, where they might very understandably be better provided for in terms of humanitarian assistance, because critically, Hamas would not be able to divert humanitarian aid provided to Palestinian citizens on the other side of the border if they were permitted into Egypt. So there are many reasons to be calling on Egypt to comply with its international law obligations, and it's extremely troubling that we've not heard that from any authoritative quarter internationally.
That actually brings me to my next question, which is another question from the audience, which is, why do you think there has been a lack of pressure on Egypt, as well as even Jordan, to take in Gazans, Palestinians, so that Israel can deal with Hamas without them being a human shield?
I think there are many layers to the analysis on that, and I have to stress, I mean, this is informed, I suppose, by my own reading and 20 odd years of following the international relations in that part of the world closely. Plainly, Egypt is understandably fearful of the Muslim Brotherhood within Egypt itself, and of course Hamas is part of that, and their treatment of Hamas and of Gaza of course has been reprehensible. They have, unlike Israel, that has been providing resources across the border until the 7th of October, when so much of that infrastructure that Israel was providing electricity and water with was actually attacked by Hamas. and destroyed, because the pipes and electricity is running through the communities on the south that Hamas attacked. So in contrast to Israel's support of the citizenry of Gaza, Egypt has policed its border robustly and has taken lethal action along that border where it felt it was justified. Why aren't we seeing so that's why, of course, there's an understandable assessment by those who understand Egypt's position that would put Egypt in a difficult position, and that Egypt would be reluctant, but that doesn't really explain why, for instance, the United States, with all of the billions that they support the Egyptians with, wouldn't think it sensible to use that leverage in a way that would plainly save Palestinian lives in this horrific context. When we come to the wider Arab world, we have seen a call that no Palestinian should be permitted to leave Gaza because they object to what they call a displacement. In some quarters, referenced a second Nakba. Now, in that context, of course, we would have to analyse exactly what is meant by the first Nakba. We probably don't have time on this call to go into the details of 1948 and the deep misrepresentations, which, of course, over the last 75 odd years have taken root with respect to what happened in 1948. But it's very important that we don't see similar misrepresentations here. An evacuation of civilians across the border from where Hamas is using them as civilian human shields is intended to save their lives. And Israel's recommendations that they evacuate on that basis have unfortunately also been utterly misrepresented as an attempt to displace. So I think that narrative, which has taken hold of the world, is plainly playing a role in the reluctance of many international actors to call out Egypt's own violations of its international law obligations.
Thank you so much, Natasha. It seems that we are unfortunately out of time, so I would like to thank you again for this amazing presentation. I'd also like to thank our audience for showing up. You guys are the backbone of Emet. And if you feel that this webinar was informative and you liked it, please consider giving Emet a donation. Thank you so much.
Been my pleasure.
Natasha, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. Brilliant. In the American sense of the term.
Thank you.